Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Tuesday, November 26th, 2024. My name is Sam Seder. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Richard Beck, senior writer at N+1 magazine, author of Homeland, The War on Terror in American Life. Also on the program today, President-elect Donald Trump threatens a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico and to up it another 10% on China. Meanwhile, Boris Epstein, kneecapped by rivals in the Trump orbit, accused, if you can believe this, of monetizing his relationship with Trump. No. Daddy Bird gets his beak wet first.
Yeah, Trump didn't get a cut. That's the problem.
Jack Smith moves to dismiss without prejudice Trump's January 6th and documents case. Without prejudice means it can be brought back. Biden administration proposes Medicare, Medicaid to cover weight loss drugs like Ozempic. Third woman dies under Texas's abortion ban as OBGYNs begin to flee Texas. Missouri Supreme Court upholds ban on trans care for minors. Charlotte airport workers strike over low wages. And congrats! Bird flu found in samples of raw milk in California. That should work out well.
Innovation.
Sunshine will fix that.
An important runoff for Mississippi's Supreme Court elections today. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. It is
Newsday Tuesday.
Except
Sort of not.
Except we're not going to be doing those
all
news. Yeah,
right.
It's a little bit mixed up today. It doesn't matter. We're going to, in 2025, we may change the whole lineup of days.
Yeah.
We might do the show at midnight.
We might do the show at midnight. We may actually do Mondays. What is now considered Tuesdays, we will do a Monday show. What is now considered Tuesday,
let me pull
we'll do
everyone
a Wednesday show.
Back behind the curtain. This is what you floated to me yesterday. I still don't fully understand the reasoning behind Newsday Tuesday rhymes. It works, right? Because Fun Day Monday could be anything. Hump Day could be anything. But Newsday Tuesday, that's when we should be doing the news on that day, right?
Yeah, that's not why we did the news on Tuesday.
Right.
We just backfilled it so we can do whatever we want.
We can. We did just sell a bunch of merch that has the calendars of the days that we branded them.
You know, last night I was watching the Celtics with Saul, and he's like, why do they have neon green and black? And I'm like, that's because they want to sell more merch. So they wear it one day, and then all of a sudden you can buy it because you can only buy one white and green shirt and one green and white shirt.
Right.
So
that sucks about the NBA.
But they don't change their names.
I hate the Nikeification of the NBA. It's spread into the NFL.
Nike
too.
has nothing to do with us changing the days and selling new merch based upon the new days.
And making the old merch with Newsday Tuesday obsolete.
Not obsolete. Classic.
Okay.
But for what?
That's
still the question. You want to shake things up, but why are we starting there? Is the real thing
we've
discussed with you.
We are tying the value of the classic Majority Report merch to Bitcoin. So
great. We are definitely changing things up then.
Newsday Tuesday is fun to say, says WTF Cody. Well, you could still say it if we don't do it anymore. But all right, let's get right into this. One other thing I want to just mention in the event that we don't get to it. The Biden administration proposed Medicare and Medicaid to cover weight loss drugs. These are Ozempic, Wegovy. There's been estimates that it could cost, billions of dollars. My guess is this is a little gift to the Trump administration. Basically saying, okay, we're going to float this idea out there. I mean, I from a policy standpoint, I need to read more into it. I've read some things about it, but the bottom line is like, these drugs appear to be safe. They've certainly been used for an extended period of time in the context of diabetes, but only more recently as like I don't know if I would call it a cosmetic thing, but in terms of weight loss, but it's also being used in terms of addiction and other things. There's going to be a huge savings associated with having population lose weight in terms of diabetes down the road, in terms of like heart disease, in terms of all sorts of other issues. Maybe even if it helps in terms of addiction, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. I'm agnostic on that question. But it is going to be interesting to watch the Trump administration and RFK, who has said that he thinks these things are the demon seed, rejected out of hand. RFK, I guess maybe the government will pay for testosterone. Maybe that'll be what the government does. Everybody will get their T shot, and or everybody who wants one.
It would be nice if we could make America healthy again by everybody being able to have 2 hours of exercise every day and going outdoors and having the free time to do that. The problem with whatever RFK is selling in terms of health is that it is from a rich guy's perspective.
Yeah.
It's the same thing when like people are like, a banana costs the same as a Big Mac. All right, well, try working, 2 jobs, 6 hours each or whatever, multiple shifts back to back on a frickin' banana, right? Like this is the kind of stuff that's not practical for people who are living paycheck to paycheck.
We got multiple IMs already saying that people have been helped by Wegovy, et cetera, et cetera. I definitely know people who have, without a doubt. I'm not. I'm being agnostic about that. It's really more I'm talking about the political implications of it.
But I support generically the government covering it.
I support the government covering all medication.
Exactly. Just to put that out there.
Yeah. I mean, whether it is properly prescribed in certain areas is another question.
Right.
All right. Let's get in briefly into the tariff question. And it is important for people to get into this mindset right now. Donald Trump is an idiot when it comes to policy. Remember, this is a guy who literally looked over to his doctors in a press conference and said, I don't know if anybody's thought about injecting bleach in to kill the COVID. And then looked to the doctors because he was spitballing, but he wanted to make sure that if this was actually possible, that he would get the credit for it.
Yep.
So understand what's going on in this guy's mind. A, thinks that you can inject bleach, or it's possible you could inject bleach in to kill a virus. B, that he's the first one to think of this. It occurred to him. And so he says it in public and he looks at the doctor. So he's just like, look, if you end up doing this and this solves the whole thing, I want credit because my uncle went to MIT. But the other thing you got to remember about Donald Trump is he wants loyalty and money. One of those two things. Always. Every policy he projects is a way to get there. So before let's read this. As everyone is aware, thousands of people pouring through Mexico and Canada, bringing crime and drugs at levels never seen before. This is not true. We don't have people pouring through the border. It's at a low ebb historically. They're not bringing crimes and drugs in at levels never seen. Most of the of fentanyl, for that matter, or whatever drug you're talking about, comes in through legal ports. But
and to the extent
back to the caravan, by the way,
to the extent drugs are passing the American-Canadian border, they are going from America to Canada.
And on that end, yes. Right now, a caravan coming from Mexico, composed of thousands of people, seems to be unstoppable. Maybe almost as many people who were in the Madison Square Garden for that last rally.
Thousands?
Seems to be unstoppable in its quest to come through our currently open border.
Is this the bullet train?
On January 20th, one of my first many executive orders, I'll sign all necessary documents to charge Mexico and Canada a 20% tariff on all products coming to the U.S., and its ridiculous open borders. This tariff will remain in effect till such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and illegal aliens stop the invasion of our country. Both Mexico and Canada have the absolute right and power to solve this long simmering problem. First off, this is absurd. Why would their wall be any different from our wall? We have far more resources. I've had many talks with China about the massive amount of drugs, particularly fentanyl, being sent to the United States, but to no avail. Representative of China told me they would institute their maximum penalty, that of death, for any drug dealers caught doing this. So unfortunately, they never followed through. Drugs are pouring into our country, mostly through Mexico, at levels never seen before. Until the time they stop, they'll be charging China an additional 10% tariff. Okay. All right. So how will he implement this? Here's a study from Lehigh University that came out in October. Politically connected corporations received more exemptions from U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports, study finds. In other words, did you donate to Donald Trump? If you did donate to Donald Trump, this study shows that you are more likely to be granted a waiver.
Or are you doing business with, say, Peter Thiel or someone like that, who has a lot of money in different pots and places that do manufacturing in China?
Are you doing business with somebody who is, has donated to Donald Trump? This is the nature of the game that is going to be happening. So, yes, I would bet that Trump is going to impose these tariffs. But yes, I would say it's going to be like Swiss cheese, depending upon which entity has been supportive of him. Yeah. That's that. I mean, end of story.
And to clarify, if he were to impose this, it could generate revenue for the federal government. I saw Jeff Stein of the Washington Post said over 10 years it would raise $1 trillion. But you know what it would do that on the back of? American consumers. It's a regressive tax it's a regressive price increase if it were to be imposed in the way that he's describing it. Because tariffs are the reason, Mexico isn't paying the tariff. Canada isn't paying the tariff. China isn't paying the tariff. It's offset onto the American consumer. So in theory, why tariffs can be effective is if they're targeted to say let me boost this American manufacturing sector because they're struggling to compete with this company because their prices are so low. So we put a tariff on it, it raises its prices, and what do you know? More folks are going to go for the cheaper option that's made here domestically. That's when tariffs can be effective. But as a broad revenue generating mechanism, it's regressive taxation. It's doubling down on a sales tax, basically.
We're not going to be getting more of farming of tomatoes in this country. No. Let's put it that way.
And by the way, 2/3 of our tomatoes come from Mexico. And I saw some study, apparently Americans consume 20 on average pounds of tomatoes every year. So that's going to go up wherever you get your salads or whatever, or sandwiches. 90% of our avocados come from Mexico. And then the biggest trade partnership we have with them as well are cars and car parts. So this is not, that's where I think the Swiss cheese thing could come in.
Well, we also better hope. Because I think we're not in a position to win trade wars like this. All of a sudden, these countries are a lot. Mexico's in a stronger position now. These countries are. I would
also suggest that if China decides to do the same thing with our products, we are effed.
And that's the thing is I think you guys are right. This is not about revenue or about spurring production. It is about grift. And so like it's going to be layered out to the extent that they have the winners selected and sort of set up beforehand. Without
a doubt. All right. Since we're on the topic of grift, do we have time to do this one, do you think? We have time to do one more? When I read this story, I was like, what? Now, for the past week or two, we have been reading stories of dissent amongst the Trump inner sanctum. I don't even know if we've talked about it because, I mean, at the end of the day, who gives a shit? It's not going, excuse my language, who gives a crap? It is not going to in any way change the trajectory of this administration. I hope we've learned that lesson from last time around. The Trump White House is going to be chaotic. There's going to be infighting. There's going to be people who get pushed out of the circle and into the circle and back out of the circle and back into the circle and so on and this and that. And there's no one individual who Trump needs. Bannon could be jettisoned and Giuliani could be in or whatever. It's irrelevant. They are doing demo. They are doing destruction. And one meathead can do it with another. You know, folks like Russ Vought, all they need is like a pulse in the Oval Office and a go ahead and nobody to actually slow them down. And that's basically, there is not going to be anybody in that White House who's going to slow anybody like a Russ Vought down at the Office of Management and Budget. So they're going to destroy the administrative state one way or another. So, you know, we don't do those stories, but this is fascinating from the perspective of how dear leaderish this is. And this is a slightly different dynamic because Boris Epstein is a piece of garbage as far as I'm concerned. He spent his off-Trump years on Sinclair Media for, I think, at least 2 or 3 of them, basically espousing BS in their 60 stations across the country or whatever it is, the owner-operated stations they have. It's right-wing local media that has been franchised out, essentially, or networked.
As loyal as a Trump loyalist gets. Let's just put that out there.
Without
Boris
a doubt.
has been there. I remember from the interviews conducted back in the 2016 Spin Room. He was one of Trump's top surrogates, and he's been the Trumpy guy
and
from the beginning.
And it wasn't because he's so smooth talking. Let's put it that way.
He gets like 200 views on Sinclair's uploads.
And but he has been in shoving matches with Elon Musk, right? And who else was he in a shoving match with?
Critical support. Howard Lutnick.
And Howard Lutnick, who was the who chaired the transition thing. And remember, Musk and RFK wanted Lutnick to be the head of, wanted to be Treasury Secretary, and ended up only getting commerce. He is also a big crypto guy from Cantor Fitzgerald.
Rumble investor.
And Rumble investor. Yep. So Lutnick is very much in favor, and it sounds like Epstein is on the outs because the idea that Epstein has been monetizing his relationship with Donald Trump, can you believe this? It is shocking.
You're playing the game called capitalism.
Report by John Solomon today about Boris Epstein.
Oh, pause it. I should tell you, John Solomon is is he still at the AP? He was a right-winger for a long time. Then I think he went to the AIE, and now maybe he's back to reporting? I don't know. Go.
Report by John Solomon today about Boris Epstein, an advisor to your father, a longtime advisor, internal investigation by the Trump transition when they heard allegations from Scott Bessent and others that Boris Epstein was allegedly, we have not confirmed this, was trying to shake down people for access, for contracts, for money. Any comments on this tonight?
Yeah. Listen, I've known Boris for years, and I've never known him to be anything but a good human being. So, that said, I will tell you, my father has been incredibly clear. You do not do that under any circumstance, and believe me, there will be repercussions if somebody was. So, I've never seen that side of him. I've known him for a very long time, and I certainly hope the reporting's false. And I can also tell you, if it's true, the person will probably no longer be around.
All right, Eric. Report by John Solomon.
Trump,
wow,
the
there
guy
you go.
Who was selling watches just like a few months ago that were seemingly
monetize
advertised.
Me. He doesn't monetize me. You don't give me a kickback, and it's going to blow back on you. That's the way. That's my saying.
So Boris didn't give him a cut?
No kickback.
Yeah.
Yes, blowback.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my new saying.
Yeah. The only bribes they take are from like the Saudis after they deliver for them, and then $2 billion invested in Kushner's building.
This is going to be really important for people when you start to consume media in this era. Things like, why is Trump pushing this tariff? It doesn't make any sense. It does make sense. You're just thinking about what his incentive structure is wrong. Oh my God, Boris Epstein. Laura Ingraham is not reporting on corruption in the inner circle of Donald Trump's inner circle unless there is a team within the inner circle that is against another team and they're pushing it. And now you have a sense of which side Laura Ingraham's on, or at least which side she thinks is winning. That's all this is. That is all this is. People need to be able to, watch the media and understand why we are hearing what we're hearing. This is always the case. It's even more the case right now because it's that naked.
And there's now a secondary media ecosystem that is trying to obscure that media literacy. That's trying to take what these Trump people are saying at face value and make it as so like, oh, maybe they're populist and responding to the public. No. What? There's so much credulity that's being assigned to these Trump people the second time around that frankly is in really bad faith, I think, from both our mainstream media to our supposedly independent online space. That's really self-serving, but also and obscures the truth of the matter, which is like, if you see anybody calling this out and saying Trump's taking corruption really seriously, immediately know that that's a source that you should never trust again.
Okay, in a moment, we're going to be talking to Richard Beck. He's a senior writer at N+1 magazine, author of Homeland, The War on Terror in American Life. A really big and important book. But first, word from our sponsor. Obviously, we're living in a very polarized political environment. Privacy services that stop personally identifiable information, I guess they call this PIL, such as cell phone numbers and home addresses from easily being searched and purchased are becoming a necessity. I don't want to creep you out, but go and Google your name and you'll find about 5 dozen of these search databases. And as you know, doxing and all sorts of politically motivated, threatening online behavior is at its sort of peak. You cannot always control whether you're a target, but you can make it harder for threat actors to escalate threats by taking a proactive approach to the security of your personal information. Data brokers make a profit off your data. Your data is a commodity. Anybody on the web can buy your private details, and this can lead to identity theft, phishing attempts, harassment, unwanted spam calls. Now you can protect your privacy with Delete Me. I have been using this service for probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years. And it's effective. What it does is it not only sort of like goes to all these data brokers and pulls down your information, it continually does this because they continually repopulate it. And there's a lot of my information out there, obviously, and I don't want it to be. Not just, because of the nature of the work that I do, but look, if they find some of your information on the dark web, the way that scammers will do this, they'll find your email address, and then they'll go to one of these sites, they'll plug in your email address, and then they'll get the other details. And then that becomes part of their phishing scam or part of their identity theft.
And they don't need to go after you. They can go after, say, your grandparents and tell them, hey, Matt's
It
been
will
arrested.
show you related people in these things. It's really problematic. Yeah. Matt is in trouble. Hey, Grandma.
Happened.
Literally happened
to
my grandparents.
Oh.
They got it. They thought I was arrested and were about to wire money. And they called my parents and said, I haven't heard anything about that. Hold off on that.
Well,
thank God
it's not that hard to believe. But we want to thank our sponsor for today's episode, Delete Me. Sign up and provide Delete Me with exactly what information you want deleted, and their experts take it from there. Delete Me sends you a regular personalized privacy report showing what they found, where they found it, what they removed. If they need updates, send you a digest every month. Delete Me isn't just a one-time service. Delete Me is always working for you, constantly monitoring and removing the personal information you don't want on the internet. Put it simply, Delete Me does all the hard work of wiping you and your family's personal information. Your and you's family? Whatever. Personal information from data broker websites. You understand what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Take control of your data. Keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners, get 20% off your Delete Me plan by texting majority to 64,000. Text majority to 64,000. That's the word majority to 64000. All right, we'll put that link in the podcast and YouTube description. Take a quick break. And we'll come back with Richard Beck, senior writer at N+1 magazine, author of Homeland, The War on Terror in American Life. I laughed because somebody on the IM wrote Sam Seder. Take it from me, Sam Seder. Identity theft is a real problem. There you go. All right, quick break. We'll be right back. We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Richard Beck, senior writer at N+1 magazine, author of Homeland, The War on Terror in American Life. Richard, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's just contextualize this. I mean, Emma was very excited. Millennial perspective on this. I'm a little bit older, what made you were 14 on 9/11? What fascinated you or enough about this sort of this dynamic? I mean, how did you have a sense that this was even a thing in some ways? The idea that we are living in really a post-9, or I guess as the other Beck, I don't know if he's a relative, Glenn Beck would say a 9/12 world.
Not a relative as far as I know of, thankfully. I think that I do think I wrote the book in part because of my specific generational position, which is that, as you say, I was 14 on 9/11, and that meant I was old enough to have a solid base of memories of what life in the country was like before the war on terror started. But I wasn't really old enough to have a politics of my own. I think, I'd gone through sort of your basic public school civics classes. I'd been given the kind of standard story about what the country was for and how it worked. But, aside from just the politics that my parents and the other adults around me had, I didn't have any politics that I identified with. And I had to form those in the context of the war that was then launched and then proceeded to unfold. So I think that, people who are even just a few years younger than me maybe don't have that base of memories of what it felt like to be in the United States before the war on terror. And I think people who are even just a few years older than me, when 9/11 happened, they already had this set of political beliefs that they could draw on to interpret the world around them. But I found myself having to the ground was really shifting under my feet, right, as I came into political adulthood.
Well, it's fascinating. I was 7 on 9/11. I know that upset Sam a little bit, but I was in suburban New Jersey, right 30 minutes outside of New York, which I think colors that perspective a lot. My dad was supposed to be in the World Trade Center that day, and we didn't know where he was, right? Like, those are experiences, I think, that a lot of people in the tri-state area had. But broadly about politics, I don't have those memories, right? Prior to 9/11, that's when I remember thinking about politics really for the first time. Mm-hmm. And there's been some discourse about this election and why, Gen X is more Trumpy, and Gen Z, some voters kind of swung towards Trump in a way, but millennials are pretty solidly Democratic. And does that, in your view, have to do with the experience of the war on terror? Is it also the financial collapse and how that affected folks' politics? What do you make of that and how it informs like millennial ideology in this country today?
I think that I think there could be something to that. I think when I read about Gen Z swinging toward Trump more than before, the explanation I've heard that seems the most plausible to me is that the Democrats in this campaign, and now for almost 10 years, have been really hammering on this idea of Trump as an aberration from the norm, as something unprecedented, as something that shouldn't be part of how politics works in the United States. And if you're young enough at this point, your response is, what are you talking about? Trump isn't normal. Of course, right. Trump is normal. Trump has been a figure since I was a teenager. This idea that he's some kind of aberration would just seem sort of ludicrous. I do know that for my own part, the base of memories that I had to draw on weren't so much political. I grew up in a pretty affluent suburb. My parents were basically all standard liberal Democrats. If a reasonable Republican came along, my dad would kind of give him a hearing before ultimately voting for the Democrat like he was supposed to.
Bill Weld's a nice guy. I think he's a pretty sharp guy, Bill Weld.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember him saying nice things about, say John McCain. But I do remember, what it felt like to be in an airport before 9/11 and how different it feels to be in an airport now. And not just airports, but really all kinds of public spaces, which now, once you start looking at the architecture of them, are so obviously hostile to the idea that anything like a public would actually try and inhabit those spaces. So I watched a lot of that change over the course of my adolescence and my 20s. And that certainly informed my politics. In 2008, all of my friends were totally ecstatic when Obama won, because I would have been 22 years old, and didn't have any experience of activism, hadn't had any real exposure to left-wing politics. But the experience then of watching Obama not only not end the war on terror, which he didn't say he was going to do explicitly, but he certainly implied that he thought, the Bush administration had been totally crazy and irresponsible, and he was going to wind this down. Instead of ending that conflict and winding it down, he ended up sort of bureaucratizing it and rationalizing it. He made it something that didn't seem so chaotic, and where there wasn't some new disaster, eating up our TV screens every day, but he certainly didn't end it. And, that in combination with the bank bailouts, it was this period of really intense disappointment that certainly began to push me to the left in a meaningful way, and that pushed a lot of, people in my age cohort to the left as well.
That's interesting. I mean, I want to just spend just a little bit more time as you as an avatar, and then go through these bigger stories, because I think, at the time I do recall feeling like if Obama does not deliver, there's going to be a lot of disillusioned young people, and I think that could really go either way. I mean, so you see as a 14-year-old the material implications of this change from pre to post 9/11. Was it Obama or something else in that wake that ended up like does it leave you in a vulnerable place looking for some type of sense of way out of a certain area, certain, I don't know, headspace or political space, as you're going through your teen years, and then Obama seems to show up and provide that, and then doesn't. And I'm also struck, incidentally, too, it has never really occurred to me about that, about the architecture, but how Occupy was the antithesis of not gathering in public. I mean, that was that's what was happening at that time.
Yeah, Obama's first term was extremely disillusioning for me. I write about this a little in the book, but in 2012, I couldn't bring myself to actually vote for him for re-election. And, I lived in New York. He was leading Romney by a fair margin, so it didn't feel like there were huge stakes to my voting or not. But I remember being depressed about it and angry about it. At the same time, I'm glad you brought up Occupy because, when Obama was elected, you also have to remember before Obama, I'm raised kind of a standard liberal Democrat. And, a show like The West Wing was my parents' favorite television show of all time. And Obama shows up like The West Wing come to life in 2004, and then especially in 2008. And so in 2008, the entire Bush presidency, again, the story was a little bit like Trump, this idea of this extraordinary aberration. The idea was, well, the problem is that Bush is so stupid and his vice president and all the other people who advise him are so uniquely malicious and evil that if we can just kick that administration out, then of course we're going to wind this down. That turned out not to be the case. So that was a huge disappointment. And then when Occupy happened, I remember that very vividly because I was living in New York by that point. That was the first event that I remember, feeling myself spoken to as a political adult and feeling myself being asked not just to think as a citizen, but actually act as one. Because one of the things that had been disappointing about the first Obama term was this idea in 2008 that, we're all participating in making this incredible good thing happen. And then, of course, notoriously, when Obama was elected, he had this enormous, Move On email list, all these people who were just ready to be put to work, which then he demobilized.
It was Obama for America.
Yes.
That he very purposefully demobilized. And in fact, right. I would say in the summer leading up to that, he not only ultimately demobilized what was then Obama for America, but there was quite a bit of reporting, and certainly in outside groups that I had spoken to, his people, his campaign said, do not donate to these outside groups. So he demobilized a lot of the progressive infrastructure outside of the campaign because they didn't want to be influenced by where other people's agendas. So yeah, there was definitely a lot of that. In fact, I quite vividly remember having on this program both Matt Stoller and Glenn Ford from the Black Agenda Report, who were making the case that Glenn Ford was making the case that Obama was actually the more evil, and Stoller was saying that Romney would be better. And in retrospect, I think there's an argument, maybe a stronger one about George Herbert Walker Bush over Bill Clinton in '93, frankly. But leaving that aside, all right. Well, let's move into this because one of the things, and then I want to get into sort of the specific. You have 4 parts to your book that basically talk about 4 different phenomena or crises or things that grew out of in the wake of 9/11. But one of the themes that I wonder, I just want to start broadly, you talk about a bipartisan, that so much of what we saw in the wake of 9/11. In terms of the militarism that you write about, the sort of the reaction was bipartisan. But on some level, I wonder also if it wasn't national. It wasn't just the political parties. It seemed to me that the Democrats were being or at least felt like they were being brought to heel by the American public and media as much as anything else. I mean, that was my sense at that time, watching, and I'm not a fan of Bill Maher's, but watching him get basically booted off of television in the wake of 9/11, the Dixie Chicks, but also, working and knowing Janine Garofalo, like there was a lot of anger if you spoke about anything that was not in line. I mean, never mind if you were a politician. I mean, if you were just like, people would get out of their car in New York City to go up into Janine Garofalo's face and start yelling at her. I mean, it was a scary time, and particularly the first couple of years.
Yeah, I think that, I think it's important to keep in mind, and the first proper chapter of the book is about September 11, the specific day. But, this is the worst single trauma in the country's history. In terms of the vividness, the immediacy, the humiliation of it, the sense of helplessness. I talk about that quite a bit, especially the kind of narratives about the heroic firefighters who certainly were courageous and who certainly tried their best to help people. But the truth was there was just no one to help, right? There was no one to save. And a lot of the reaction coming out of it was sort of the standard response to feelings of helplessness and humiliation, which is, I will do whatever I have to do to make sure I never feel that way again. That's totally unbearable. So you're right. It wasn't just bipartisan. It's certainly, the political system played a part in it, but you could see it anywhere, not just in media, but in cultural life that you care to look. The way people dress, the kinds of cars they want to drive. You talk about SUVs getting bigger and bigger and bigger
Hummers.
and bigger.
Yeah, Hummers. Where like it was, I mean, these were literally, I mean, you write about this militarism, literally military vehicles that were barely repurposed for, city and country life.
And also, part of their appeal was not just their size, but if you look at the design, the way that the angles on these cars start to harden, like they start to look more like military vehicles, in addition to being as big as military vehicles. And even, I remember this was a huge rolling controversy during my adolescence that was about their gas mileage, because An Inconvenient Truth had come out. That was my first experience of climate change being a big part of the national discourse. And, the idea that a Hummer got like 11 miles to the gallon in a city or something was seen as a scandal. On the other side, you have this narrative about, the Middle East is where we get our oil from. And there's a kind of defiance to saying, well, I'm going to buy this truck not only because it looks like it kicks ass and because I feel threatened all the time, and now I feel more dangerous to others if I'm inside this truck, but I'm going to consume as much gas as I want. It was part of this idea that that everyone repeated over and over, not just the Bush administration, but Obama would say things like this too, that we can't let the terrorists change our way of life. If we let them change our way of life, then the terrorists have won.
Yeah.
That was
Richard,
just totally pervasive.
This is exactly the same thing we're seeing with Trump, right? Like it comes back to the idea of we want to trigger the libs. Like, I remember that too. I remember when An Inconvenient Truth came out, some parents they showed it at my school. Some parents wouldn't let their kids go. It was a whole controversy. But even the Hummer stuff, like that was a way to say, screw you liberals who care about the environment, you tree huggers. It's more valuable to me to make you upset than it is for me to build a better world. And that was 20 years ago. And that is the core of Trumpism, really, at the end of the day, is they like more than anything that he pisses off these people that they don't like.
Yeah, I think there's certainly something to that, and like everyone, we're talking about like 20 years ago, so everyone's got their own experience of it. But obviously there was an element of wanting to trigger the libs, though that wasn't the phrase that people used back in 2004, 2005 or whatever. But there's also just, even absent the libs, it just made people feel better about themselves. It's a psychological shoring up mechanism, and I think you can't ignore that as part of what made it so appealing and so powerful.
I know for sure that it was a consistent and major theme of Rush Limbaugh's program in that era, in the 2002, 2003. In those 2 years in particular, because I was consuming a lot of Rush Limbaugh. Unfortunately, it was in California at the time. And a constant refrain was taking your little Prius type of thing onto, the EV Jeep that I think it was Toyota put out, had been taken off the road in the late 90s. They made a certain number of them, and he was talking. It was always a joke about how he would take his SUV and run right over that thing, and it would get up to 40 miles an hour. And I mean, that was a big sort of like totem for people. But let's also talk about. I mean, I think. For me, the militarization of the police at that time was a paramount theme, because we literally had a program to take weaponry from Iraq that was sort of like sidelined and sell it to police departments, or bequeath it to them, essentially. Talk about like a little bit of that sort of like. Well, we didn't have a Homeland Security prior to 2002, but that on a material basis, and then we'll talk a little bit about culture, and then I want to move on to the to some of the Islamophobia as well.
Yeah, that's something that I also remember being really struck by at the time, was that in addition to SUVs looking bigger and angrier, the cops you see out in public are more and more heavily armored and more heavily armed. You would go to a train station previously, and there might be like a guy in normal navy blues with like a handgun strapped to his hip, just like standing there reading the newspaper. And then a year later, you go to a train station and it's like 4 pairs of guys in sort of assault gear with long rifles. So that's certainly part of this like erosion of public space. And the program you talk about, I think actually predates 9/11. If I'm remembering correctly, it was Clinton who inaugurated it. And it wasn't just from Iraq, but it was, the military has all of this surplus equipment that it's not using all the time, whether because they ordered too much or because they invented something new and now this old thing is obsolete. But they said, well, let's, give it to police departments. But the rate at which police departments wanted to use that equipment certainly went up very, very quickly.
Yeah, I imagine in the wake of the end of the Cold War, there was a push to modernize our weaponry and then to sell it off. But that you started having tactical vehicles and like little urban tanks and stuff like that. And then, of course, the surveillance state. But you also write about Batman, Christopher Nolan's Batman, sort of coming out of like the sort of the cultural sort of, I guess, milieu at that time. I mean, what? Just tell us a little bit about that.
There's Batman's one of, and not just Batman, but comic book movies in general, and this kind of complete takeover of Hollywood by comic book movies and comic book heroes. You could say pretty fairly that in my book, I sort of link basically everything to the war on terror, but I try and be careful about making the attribution too direct. I will make an exception for comic book movies. I think that if 9/11 had never happened, the Marvel Cinematic Universe would not exist.
That would be so nice.
I think that what I argue in the book is that in different wars and different periods of the country's history, you get certain types of soldier figures who we lionize and want to think about and want to look at and want to imagine ourselves being, right? So you've got G.I. Joes You've got doughboys. In the 21st century, and since 9/11, it's been the special forces soldier. So it's not a big mass of troops marching across a field. It's not some squadron of grunts running through the jungle. It's this small, tight group of people who represent some of the most incredible single investments of human capital in history, right? They're trained to within an inch of their lives. They're totally covered in the most sophisticated technology we have, and they can do basically anything they want to. They can talk to anyone in the world through their communication devices. They have night vision. They're extremely light. They're quick. That's what Iron Man is. That's what Batman is. Batman is a Navy SEAL, but cooler looking and with even better stuff. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that those movies took off after 9/11 and once the war on terror really got up and running.
What's that? I just want to. What's that a function of? I mean, is that a function of do you think some type of group aspirations to have full power over this? I'm trying, because I know that look, Rumsfeld's agenda at that time was to recreate the military into a military that does not exist on a battlefield in the way that, but it is much lighter, much more mobile, able to go anywhere, much more geared up than, we were used to. But I also wonder if it's not you have in the late 90s, I think it was all of the sort of the last gasp of the Greatest Generation and World War II films. We had the Thin Red Line, I think it was, and Saving Private Ryan, and almost like a pushback against all the Vietnam movies that were hey, maybe this isn't so heroic after all. Was this just to sort of say we're not going to engage in the morality of what's going on here, but rather we're just going to get geared up and get Buffy about it?
Well, I think that the reforms that Rumsfeld wanted to make, the sort of label that they went under was RMA, or Revolution in Military Affairs. And the idea was that you would have, as you say, a smaller military, a more agile military, more mobile, instantaneous global communication. The fog of war will cease to exist. We'll know everything that's happening on the battlefield at all times. And some of that had to do with this, standard Republican impulse just to shrink down and privatize as much of the government as possible. But I also think that was in response to an accurate understanding of the way in which the threats to America's global dominance were changing, right? There isn't a superpower for us to oppose anymore. The Soviet Union is gone. And one of my favorite documents that I found while researching the book was a paper written for the House Journal of the Army War College by a guy named Major Peters. And it was basically about, what does the future of conflict look like? And he said, and this is played out, it's not going to be on major battlefields. It's not going to be with a major superpower. It's going to be in extremely poor, enormous cities all over the third world. It's going to be places where political instability is chronic, where there are no good political solutions to impose. And so what the US will have to do in order to maintain its position at the top of the pyramid is instead just manage that disorder.
Right.
And so if you're fighting small, diffuse, fractured, constantly forming and disintegrating and reforming groups, you need small, mobile, tactically agile military units to fight that kind of war. And obviously, when you talk about superhero movies, when you talk about some sheriff in the middle of rural Iowa thinking that he needs, a mine-resistant truck, there's elements of hysterical fantasy to it, right? Rural Iowa is not the target for a terrorist attack, and it never has been, and it never will be. At the same time, it's not purely delusional. Those are, in fact, a lot of the threats that the U.S. has had to manage. And this is not me saying that the way it does that is moral. I'm talking from the perspective of, sort of pure power politics. How does the U.S. remain the global hegemon? So in that sense, there's something quite reality-based about it. Even if it isn't a solution to the problems that are sort of perpetuating America's decline as hegemon, no one knows what the solution is. So the best you can do is try and put it off and delay it and manage it for as long as possible. I think that's where we've been for about 20 years.
That's also, what Peter's described there is also, essentially what the Project for New American Century was espousing in a broader strategic way, right? Like the idea that we're going to be a hyperpower and we're going to, with the fall of the Soviet Union, this is what Cheney, and Pearl and all of these neocons had written 10 years earlier, 9 years earlier, 8 years earlier, was that, we're going to be a hyperpower, and the way that we maintain that is to manage these low-level conflicts, not necessarily extinguish them, but just to manage them so that, there's enough resources being expended so that nobody decides to gang up on us. There was the fear of China, I believe, was manifesting itself that early with these folks. I want to. We should talk about the Islamophobia, but address that, because I do want to get into the third part of your book, which I think is sort of like the for me is like most interesting.
Yeah, I think that in some the neocons, there's a book that I think is very useful to read for kind of an overview of what the neocons were about, called Clear and Present Dangers, and it's a collection of essays that was published right around 9/11, maybe right after or right before, I can't remember exactly. But it sort of says, here are the threats that the U.S. faces. And in some ways, I think that the neocons were actually a little bit further away from reality than someone like Major Peters was, because they do remain very fixated on potential great power conflicts to come. And they do talk about China, but back in 2000, 2001, there wasn't yet this sense of inevitability that China was going to be the challenger to U.S. dominance. And there's a lot of, frankly, panicky writing in that book about someone like Saddam Hussein, right? And that was part of why we went to Iraq, was because they had this idea that Saddam actually aspired to regional hegemony, or that he had anything like the capacity to achieve it. So I think that ended up having to do with why the war in Iraq went so badly, was because this picture that they painted of, well, there's this brutal Stalin or Hitler-like autocrat who aspires to regional dominance, and we've got to take him out and then rebuild the whole Middle East, just like we rebuilt Europe after World War II. That logic felt inflected too much by Second World War nostalgia. That wasn't actually the world that we were living in anymore. And we've seen all of the, various unpredictable consequences of that decision ever since.
But that is why they had to sell it in the way that you were framing it earlier, right? Even with the superhero part, when you say Batman, I know it sounds silly, but like people have talked about The Dark Knight as a movie that helped sell the war on terror. And that movie ends, spoiler alert, with them basically saying that Batman is the hero Gotham deserves, not the one it needs right now, because that movie is about a do-gooder in government who eventually turns bad because, that's what the system creates. And you need somebody who's a vigilante with all this armor on, with all these tanks, to break the law and F people up, or else we're not going to have safety in Gotham. Like that movie was just part of this was also justifying torture to the public. And that was a big part of the culture at the time.
I think that, there's a risk of reading movies too schematically, but I think it's totally justified in the case of The Dark Knight. I think that, Batman is the United States, Gotham is the world. It's important that Batman occasionally has to break rules because we have the UN and the rules of the liberal international order, but sometimes the threats are too great and you need someone who knows when it's time to strike out on his own and break rules. And Batman in that movie is such a perfect analog for the United States. There's even a scene in there, right? What is it that is
the mass surveillance part?
No.
Well, yeah.
His superpower, right? Batman really resonated because he doesn't have any magical powers. He's not Superman, who's like an alien god. He's not Spider-Man, who can literally shoot webs because of a science experiment. His superpower is that he's richer than everybody else, which is also America's position with respect to the rest of the world. But there is a scene where he's talking to his butler about how he's going to build all of the gear that he needs for his bat suit. And the butler says in so many words, well, we're going to design it here, but we're going to outsource the manufacturing to Southeast Asia. Like, that's literally in there. And I don't know what possible reason there could be for that being in there, except that that analogy is intentional.
100%.
Let's talk a little bit. I mean, the Islamophobia. I mean, I don't want to breeze by it, but I mean, I remember, getting into a cab and watching guys, regardless of whether they were from, the Middle East or, from Pakistan, or frankly, if they were Hindu, all like, it was almost like a competition. Which one could put a bigger American flag in their car so that they would not be subject to, and stories of like, two guys from Pakistan, driving upstate New York and they get arrested for it, or the Fort Dix Five. I mean, this was a relentless New York City police department had a spying operation that was massive, and infiltrating youth groups in Connecticut, and all around New Jersey, all over the place. Chris Christie was a big part of the Fort Dix Five. And it resonated. Like, I mean, Bush supposedly paid some lip service to don't being this way, but I remember making a video about the Ground Zero Mosque, which was just like a functional JCC for Muslims. That was, like 3 blocks away from Ground Zero. It was absurd. But how much of like that resonates today in your mind?
It resonates a lot ever since October 7th of last year, because the thing that I think is really, well, there's a couple things that I think are very important to keep in mind about the war on terrorist racism. One is that, and maybe this is just a pet peeve, but there's a phrase you hear all the time about how the war comes home. And the idea is that whatever, America does stuff overseas to people far away.
This is MLK. And then we drop a bomb in Vietnam and it explodes in maybe Detroit or whatever. I can't remember exactly what he said.
And then it filters back, and you'll see that phrase today in connection with militarized policing. In the specific instance of the war on terror, it's literally incorrect, because before the U.S. even had any special forces groups in Afghanistan, the FBI was rounding up Arab and Muslim immigrants inside the United States. So just in the very literal sense of the word, the war on terror started at home. It did not come back home. The other thing that I think it's important to keep in mind is you're right that George W. Bush paid lip service to religious tolerance, and he gave a speech in which he said Islam is peace. He made a show of appearing with, some prominent imam in Washington, D.C., but the deal that I think the government and the dominant segment of U.S. society decided to strike with Muslim and Arab Americans was you can practice your faith so long as it's drained of all political content whatsoever, and so long as you do not engage in any form of oppositional politics. And I write in the book about Muslim student associations at universities who talk about how, we had events where we would disrupt, say, an IDF soldier came to speak on campus, we would disrupt the speech, we would bring in, speakers who'd been involved in radical politics. We thought and worked on and talked about this stuff. And then as soon as 9/11 happened, all of that went out the window, and we were kind of reduced to these anodyne events where we would sort of explain how our holidays work and just try and gently convince people that, no, we're just as American as you. So the way that it worked after 9/11 was that Muslim and Arab Americans were excluded from the practice of citizenship because they weren't actually allowed to engage in the country's political life as citizens. And you've seen a ton of that with respect to Palestine over the past year, because even as it's become sort of barely acceptable in the mainstream media to express sympathy for, innocent victims in Gaza, the idea that you would identify with or support the cause of Palestinian resistance is still considered to be totally beyond the pale.
Yep.
Right? You are not allowed to say, I hope the Palestinian resistance beats the IDF. And so that popped up almost immediately after October 7. And I think its closest analog is clearly the immediate post 9/11 period.
I wonder if things would be different today had we the technology that we have today during the Iraq War, because I can tell you that walking around during the Iraq War, there was almost zero indication that we were waging a war with several 100,000 troops and killing, anywhere from hundreds of thousands to, 1 million people, directly. There was virtually none. There was no videos. There was no pictures of even caskets coming home were outlawed. I mean, it's fascinating, but so in some ways that was a dry run, because I don't remember an era before then. I mean, I remember when the hostage, I was probably 14 when the hostages, when Iran, the Iranian hostage crisis. And I remember the anti-Iranian, which ultimately got communicated by the time you're in central Massachusetts, the anti-Arab sentiment. But there were, and maybe I wasn't sophisticated enough to know whether people were able to have any type of, nobody was on there talking about Mossadegh, I guess, would be my guess. But even the absence, it's almost like we built a muscle memory in the wake of 9/11 that is being sort of replayed now. Yeah, it's fascinating.
And the other muscle memory piece that is interesting to me, and maybe a more productive one, is, do you think that because of that experience, that perhaps millennials and even younger understand Palestine in a different way? Because I remember, the talk about we're just in Iraq for the oil sometimes was dismissed as a lefty conspiracy theory, basically. But, when we look at Israel's placement near the Suez, when we look at our continued bloody involvement in the Middle East, I'm seeing generations just kind of understand that that's why we're there. And of course, we have surveillance technology we share with Israel and that kind of thing. But that I almost feel like was one improvement culturally, where people began to see our foreign policy through a more imperialist lens, even if it's still dragging behind where it should be.
Yeah, I think that's been, in terms of U.S. political culture, I think that's been one of the only bright spots of the past year. because in my lifetime, Occupy is the first meaningful eruption of a radical politics. That gets followed by Black Lives Matter in 2015, by Me Too, by Black Lives Matter again in 2020. But my focus writing for N+1 and working on this book has been foreign policy for quite a long time. And none of those earlier movements were internationalist in a meaningful way. And it's been heartening for me to see that as soon as October 7 happened, as soon as Israel's war began, the left in the US got it right away. And it's the first time I've seen a wholehearted internationalist component to mass political activity on the left. Which is not to say it's the first time that's happened, but the first time in the past couple of decades, I think it's reasonably fair to say.
I mean, I feel like the WTO protests in Seattle at the end of the 20th century, was a beginning to understand sort of some of those dynamics, but it wasn't really paying attention as much to what we were doing. I mean, part of it was like there were protests in 92 or 3 with the first Gulf War, but it was very quick because the war was relatively speaking pretty quick, and it wasn't nearly as widespread as the lead up to the second Iraq war. But let's talk about that notion, because you are unconvinced about the blood. This being a war for oil, and I mean, I think I'm curious as to your perspective of. I mean, I feel like war for oil is a little bit simplistic construction. Like it wasn't to get the oil as much as it was to control the oil, to make sure that, for me personally, I think this was about China for a lot of those people. I mean, I've told this story a million times about Lynn Cheney sitting down with Gary Hart and Rudman and their threats to America in the 21st century. And her insisting that it was China as opposed to non-state actors. But I'm quite convinced that the Project for a New American Century and certainly some of those players saw China as the greatest threat. And controlling Iraq's oil, not necessarily for us to have cheaper oil, but so that when China needed it for their economy, that to me struck me as like it's sort of one of their major things, but you're a little skeptical of that claim.
Yeah, I think that obviously oil played a role. I'm not denying that. The Middle East, most important oil producing region of the world. The U.S. is obviously not going to get involved with a war there without any thought for the petroleum that happens to be located there. But I think that what I resist a little bit is the slogan "No blood for oil" is kind of a shorthand explanation for the economic rationale behind the war on terror as a whole, because whatever "No blood for oil" can explain about Iraq, and I think it's actually quite limited in what it can explain, it can't begin to explain about the fact that it's a global war. That the U.S. is carrying out operations all over the place, that it is training police forces in techniques for managing civil unrest across the world, including in regions where there are no petroleum reserves to speak of. So what I wanted to do in the third section of the book, and it ended up being the part of the book that I liked working on the most, was just come up with an economic explanation for the war. Why did the U.S. think it was in its material self-interest to launch an endless global war at the beginning of the 21st century? So that was the impulse for starting that work. And I think that the answer I landed on, China's part of it, oil is part of it, but I think you do need a wide global frame to answer that question, because The US is a global superpower. And for me, the most useful context for thinking about the war's economic function is that it's happening in the context of slowing global growth, that economic growth has been slowing down ever since the 1970s. And if you go back over the 500-year or so history of capitalism, there are waves of material growth, and then that growth slows. Then growth finds a new basis for expansion and accelerates again. It hits its limits, then it slows. Each of those waves has kind of been superintended by a different power, and not to the same global extent as the United States today. But, the first one, this is following Giovanni Arrighi, who has a book called The Long 20th Century, which really unlocked a lot of this for me. But you could say the first wave of capitalist expansion is superintended by the Italian city-states. You could say the second is run by the Dutch. The third is the British Empire. And then the fourth and most recent is the US. And that was sort of put together and consolidated over the first half of the 20th century. And in between the end of the Second World War, when the US really became the leading world power for the first time, and the 1970s, you saw the fastest economic growth globally in the history of humanity. Nothing has even come close to approaching it. That's been breaking down now for about 50 years, bit by bit. If you look at average growth rates decade by decade, which provides a longer perspective than just tracking, the business cycle, global growth has slowed down from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, all the way through the present. And what the US is trying to do is manage the consequences of that slowing growth. And this is why the question of China's emergence as a new superpower is not as cut and dry as you might think, because China certainly has a lot of advantages over the US economically right now, especially the fact that its labor force is still much cheaper than America's. But China hasn't discovered some new basis for material growth expansion that the US doesn't know about. So it could be, instead of China just taking over and the US falling back into some kind of, husk of the British Empire type role, that the US and China are kind of competing for a shrinking pie.
Yes. I mean, I think the concerns about China were overblown, frankly. I'm thinking their rationale necessarily, not so much like what is rational, but I think, yes. Because China has they have a lot of challenges, too, that we don't frankly have, in some material respects. But so that idea of we are both dealing with maybe a rise in China's strength economically, and arguably who knows where ours is, but just the pie is shrinking on some level, and we haven't quite figured out the new expansion of the pie. Do you think it's crypto?
And that's also what
Bitcoin,
right?
Bitcoin or Mars?
Well, of course not. Of course, it's not those things. But this is why you see
these things developing.
All of these fantasies about here's where growth is coming from. Silicon Valley has essentially been selling one story after another of this is what's going to save economic growth. You had the first .com boom around the turn of the century, and it's not only Silicon Valley. Robert Brenner has an essay that I think everyone should read called "What's Good for Goldman Sachs is Good for America." Where he talks about the shift in the US economy because of slowing growth to basically what he calls asset price inflation. So you've got Silicon Valley around the turn of the century. The housing boom is exactly in line with this kind of thinking. And all through the first Bush term and into the second, the fantasy was that, well, home prices are going to go up forever. That's going to make everyone in America wealthier. We've unlocked the secret to growth. right?
Ownership society is what he called it.
And of course, it was based on a lie because many of the people who'd bought houses couldn't actually afford to buy them. Since then, we've seen crypto and the blockchain and Web3, and it feels like the speed at which these fantasies pop up and then just get discarded is increasing, because I am old enough to remember 3 whole months of articles about how the metaverse was going to transform all of our lives. And the reason that these keep popping up is because we don't actually have a good answer to where does the next wave of economic growth come from.
We should say this is being simulcast in Second Life right now. But part of that is also, it seems to me, that is driving that is the incredible wealth disparity that we have and the concentration of wealth. Because at one point, like, you got so much money, you don't know what to spend it on. So you are constantly looking. I mean, this is what that irrational exuberance that Greenspan was talking about in the buildup to the financial crisis was, like, people are walking around with too much cash. And by people, I mean a very narrow subset of people who have way too much cash that have been hoarding. And the only thing that they want it for is to make more cash. And so they're constantly looking for where this growth is going to become. And they almost they inflate these assets, and then you get like Bitcoin.
I mean, that's also, this increase in wealth inequality is itself a consequence of slowing growth, because if growth were still continuing, at 4% a year on average, the reason that happens is because capital is being invested in new production. It's being invested in new factories, in hiring new groups of workers. When growth slows, part of what that means is that there don't seem to be good opportunities to invest your money in new production, because the rate of return isn't high enough for it to be worth the risk. So instead of investing capital in new factories, they put it in the stock market. Companies do stock buybacks. I mean, stock buybacks are the most perfect illustration of this. You've got a corporation worth tens of billions of dollars that could be expanding its operations, but says, you know what, it's not worth it. What's worth it is for us to do stock buybacks and just inflate our balance sheets. And that in turn exacerbates slowing growth, because that money is not being put to productive use in the economy.
Interesting. All right. Well, we've held you for a really long time, but let's just briefly talk about the impunity culture, because that's sort of the world we're living in. I mean, Bill Kristol and I can't even remember his name now, Axis of Evil guy, are, I mean, hopefully it's over a little bit for them, but they are resistance heroes. We still...
Trump just got off. He just got reelected president. That's a pretty good example of impunity.
But this was accelerating, it feels like, in the context of both our government and our society, from like savings and loans to Iran-Contra. I guess you could even argue Watergate, and creating this sense. And then Obama's, one of his primary directives was to turn the page as far as he was concerned. And it really, I mean, Nancy Pelosi not that long ago was bragging about how she basically quashed an attempt to impeach Bush. It is, I would just speak to that sort of implication that comes from, how does that come from the war on terror?
I think it comes from it in a number of ways. And my last section of the book is somewhat different from the other three, because what I call impunity culture, it didn't feel like that was part of the intention setting out, although in some basic way, I guess it was, because part of the thesis of the war on terror was that the US will be an unchallengeable global power. And in that book I mentioned, Clear and Present Danger, I think it's in that book, they actually say this explicitly. They say it's not enough for the U.S. to be so powerful that it can repel any challenge. The U.S. has to be so powerful that no one would even think about trying to challenge the U.S. So in the largest sense, the goal of the war on terror, and especially invading Iraq, was to achieve global impunity, to say we don't need to exist within this system of, the liberal global order.
Escalation dominance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But from sort of the ordinary person's perspective, it's just watching these examples accrue one after the other, and some of them are extremely consequential politically or economically. Like, I remember one of the really early disillusioning moments with Obama was when he said about investigating Bush administration officials for war crimes. He starts off with this tinned language about, well, I don't believe that anyone's above the law. On the other hand, I believe in looking forward rather than looking backward.
Right.
And as soon as he said that, that meant not only is no one going to jail, no one's even being tried for anything. The fact that no bankers went to jail was also extremely disillusioning. But the thing that felt deranging about living through it was that you would also get these little inconsequential examples that just still stick in your head for years and decades. And the one that always comes to mind for me is when Dick Cheney shot his friend in the face while hunting, and then his friend apologized to him.
Yeah.
And it feels crazy making that I'll remember that for as long as I live, and even down to stupid details like the fact that when he gave his apology press conference, the bruises that covered one half of his face were the exact same shade as the tie he was wearing. Obviously, lack of meaningful accountability for torture at Abu Ghraib and elsewhere was a big one. And I know that the soldiers who appeared in the photographs were prosecuted and got in trouble, but none of the people who built the torture program ever got in meaningful trouble. John Yoo is still a professor at Berkeley.
Brennan and what's her name? Haskell?
Gina Haskell.
Gina Haskell. I mean, these people were all promoted. They all.
Brett McGurk is. I mean, I know it's not the torture, but like another Middle Eastern policy person is in Biden's administration. He was in the Bush administration.
Yeah. And I remember there's a moment I quote in the book, and this is where I think focusing on the bipartisan nature of the war is useful. Chuck Schumer gave a speech shortly after Abu Ghraib where he tried to tamp down outrage about torture and said, I understand that we all like to make speeches and we all get ourselves into a high dudgeon sometimes, but let's take a deep breath. You and I both know that if we had a terrorist who knew that there was a nuclear bomb in a major American city, that we would all feel fine about CIA guys torturing him. And that's Chuck Schumer saying that.
Right. We should say, I mean, I don't want to go too hard on this in terms of it being partisan, but Sam Harris had in 2004, right in the midst of this debate, front page, Huffington Post, when you write your own headline in defense of torture. It was just a thought experiment, but it was really just sort of one that apparently he decided to spew all over the pages. I mean,
after watching 24
this was,
for a lot of time.
And Limbaugh is talking about Club Gitmo, is selling Club Gitmo merchandise. Like, this was broadly and certainly accepted by Democrats too, without a doubt, in terms of Democratic leadership, broadly accepted. It was a creepy time.
And sorry, I think the key point about impunity culture, or what is it that impunity culture can tell you from a citizen's perspective, is that a government that has decided that no one in it can be held accountable for wrongdoing anymore is a government that has, in a meaningful material way, decided that it's no longer democratic. That it doesn't feel, and the whole premise of democratic government is supposed to be that those in power are accountable to the people who put them there.
Right.
And I think that one of the most corrosive aspects of the war on terror, and certainly one of the most demoralizing from the average person's perspective, was having it like drilled into you, like bit by bit, but eventually undeniably, that your government is not interested in what you want or what you think, and is not interested to responding to what you want. And that's something that I think on the left and in general, we still haven't even begun to really think through what the political implications of that are. And in some ways,
we just saw a part of him.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think that the far right is doing a better job, not in terms of like intellectual content, but in capitalizing on that feeling politically. I think that they have secured an advantage for themselves in that respect over the past 10 years or so.
I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, I just, Pluff was just on, I just saw a clip on PodSave where he's talking about, we need to appeal to moderates, but those people weren't politically moderate who decided to vote for Trump. They had an issue with an inside-outside type of perspective. And that plane of existence is not appreciated, at least within the professional class, it seems to me, of the Democratic Party. Well, it's a fascinating book, and we will link to it. Richard Beck, senior writer at N+1 magazine, author of Homeland, The War on Terror in American Life. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm in the podcast and YouTube description. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Richard.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break. Head into the fun half of the program. I'm still trying to find that Clear and Present Danger. Did you find that book, Matt, that he was talking about?
No, I did not.
All right, we got to try and find that, because I know that was like a Tom Clancy book. That's not what he was talking about, I don't think.
So I remember this now, where Bradley, thank you for messaging me that we had Richard on in May to talk about the Biden administration's foreign policy and their pivot to competition with China as well. And, it's amazing because I didn't even realize I've been referencing this in our past conversations. Like, he was writing about that Biden, like the foreign policy for the middle class that was being spearheaded by Jake Sullivan. And you just like, the Biden administration's failures are so much deeper than I think than we even are seeing right now, which is like a complete misreading of the political moment, in the sense of, they did really good things domestically, but he wanted to return the country to basically a pre-9/11 hegemonic period of growth at home and then dominance abroad. But there was no way to put that toothpaste back into the tube. And like, there's a whole, as Richard writes about, the public consciousness changed. So like, all of his Senate foreign relations, backroom experience and this arrogance that he put on display, people saw through that, and he was unable to adapt to that moment.
I can't help but wonder if a foreign policy for the middle class is the way that a Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk sell it to Joe Biden.
Totally.
And they have no connection to the middle class.
And has no, they're just like, this is the way to get to the big guy.
Of course.
Can we call it train?
I've been hating on the middle class.
Amtrak foreign policy. No, just call it middle class.
I've been reading my Lily Geismer, and I've been hating on the suburban sort of Democrats. One good thing they were good at is being against the Vietnam War. And it's like, who foreign policy for the middle class, unless you are getting government contracts, I don't understand how that could be convincing to anyone.
I honestly think I get the idea of returning manufacturing. I get that. But and so I could see like, okay, we're going to have spot tariffs in certain areas, or we're going to, insist on certain products being made in this country from a supply line standpoint in the wake of COVID. But cool. I think the rest of it was just a way to sell a sunsetting guy.
Well, agreed. We're going to get books in 5 years about how Biden just let these freaks run the show. And you hear how folks in Washington talk about Jake Sullivan. Oh, he stays up till 3 a.m. Oh, he's this wonderkind. Oh, he's so brilliant. And I could totally see Biden, who can't he functions from 10 a.m. to 4 or whatever they say, handing that kind of thing over. Like, why not sell? You can still...
Middle class. I'm the middle class guy.
The middle class wants us to give nuclear submarines to Australia.
Right.
That's what they're
AUKUS
really on the edge of their seat for.
Is people care about. Like, what Trump did in 2016 and on, he's not selling our domestic or our economic agenda within the confines of our military. Are you insane? Like, the branding is bad politics on top of it. He's saying, I'm going to get tough on China and Mexico. We know these tariff things aren't going to work. But, like, it's making an economic argument at its core, not making the economic secondary to our militaristic competition in the globe. And that's just a way to appeal to Biden's ego. So these West exec people were able to run the show because Biden thinks of himself as this great foreign policy mind. You know, all of that stuff should have been within the context of, like, we're delivering for you, not this broad way to connect why we're funding a genocide and also we're sending, I don't know, like internationally illegal weapons to Ukraine now, apparently.
Yeah, just don't fuck this up for us workers.
And it should be noted that Biden was in favor of the Iraq war at the beginning, so.
Oh, he wanted to, if I remember correctly, he wanted to split the country into 3.
Yep.
He wanted to give the northern part to the Kurds, the western part to the Sunnis, and the eastern part to the Shia, if I remember correctly. I mean, it
works so well with India and Pakistan. Just bifurcate these people.
What
and
about Czechoslovakia? And I mean, like,
it's great. Just set these things up. We love ethno-states. Thanks, Joe.
But that's how you can see how he views Palestine in that same context. I mean, he is an old school racist in many ways, but also he views these as like factioning. Like when he can say it's not a contradiction for him to say in the same breath.
I'm staying in the race. I remember growing up, my dad said, you stay away from those poles, but you can hang out with the eye ties.
Right.
So
yeah,
that's the way it works. Everybody gets a neighborhood.
Yeah. I'm going to promote democracy with the Palestinian people by imposing the authority that I think is right on them to rule them in the future. That's Biden's foreign policy. He returned us way more to that Bush era foreign policy than I ever anticipated when he came into office. And that is his legacy. Like the idea that we didn't clean break from that, like our entanglements in the Middle East, is Biden brought us back there.
There was a piece I just read today. I can't even remember where it was. Where I think, and someone just IM, Jake Sullivan's the guy who famously penned an article about a quieter Middle East a few days before October 7th, MJS 617. I do think that the Biden administration thought, like, all we need to do, we won't sign the Iran nuke deal. We'll get, we will sell this to Saudi Arabia. We will quiet everything down there, and we will move this whole, our whole project to about, China and Russia. And they thought they could just sort of sweep it under the side. Like, look, we were able to get past the whole indigenous genocide thing. Israel can do it too. And sweep it under the rug.
Just make connections with your neighbors.
That's right, and reach out, and that's it. And I mean, I do think that it was not a coincidence that this attack happens in a U.S. Presidential election year. I mean, obviously, 100%. Hamas is aware of what the dynamics are here, and maybe also, other elements who wanted to prevent that sort of like Pax Israel, Saudi Arabia, whatever you want to call it, also wanted to inhibit that because. I think maybe it was in reading about this book, but MBS apparently said to Biden, like, half my country is so young they don't even remember really any of the dynamics about Israel-Palestine. So if we can get past this, and
it's not like he's democratic either way, but like
I think doing a Nakba too is not the best way to get past it.
Well, it turns out that best laid plans. Speaking of which, we're going to head into the fun half. Adam, your agnosticism on them for weight loss seems to come from a thin guy's perspective. Oh, no. First of all, I was a fat kid. I'm agnostic as to the long-term health issues. I do not read too much into that. I'm just simply at this point that's not part of what I want to discuss at this point. I'm not going to make an assessment on
future long-term ramifications.
I'm not.
Dr. Sam is checked in.
Yeah. Dr. Sam is out for the day. But Sam, the political sort of like talking about the political implications of this is in. So I don't want to. I think there's a lot of. I think I was quite clear that the implications of these from a health perspective could have huge knock-on effects, like you say. Your blood pressure's down, your blood sugar, your weight, they probably lengthen your life. Yes. And from a policy standpoint, that means that Medicare and Medicaid are going to save a lot of money down the road. So, the upfront costs. But I'm talking about, the Biden administration could have done this 6 months ago. Now, maybe part of it is like the procedures that are associated with this and they weren't able to do it. But also, I think part of the reason why they're doing it is because they know they're not going to be in the administration next time, in 3 months. And they want to get this into the public consciousness, introduce the idea that Medicare and Medicaid could pay for this, and then leave the Trump people to have to deal with it, which I think is, frankly, good politics, probably good policy, but I don't want to...
You don't want to oversell it.
I don't want to make it like I am making a declaration on the safety or efficacy of these drugs. I just don't know enough about that.
But we actually know that people like the IAM exists, and actually that's why it's politically relevant if all of a sudden this gets...
It's definitely politically relevant, and it could very well be a big boon for life, I mean, for health in the future. I mean, everything I've seen at this point is that, but I will also say, like, I wouldn't get laser surgery, 30 years ago, because I was like, I'm nervous.
LASIK,
my eye, LASIK, I was like, I'm nervous because I've never met anybody who had it 25 years ago.
I mean, you wouldn't get a microwave till 2024.
I wouldn't get a microwave till 2,000 years ago. I mean, 2 years ago. But I do, I did have a friend who, he started going blind from it 20 years later.
Oh, LASIK?
LASIK, yeah, that's why I'm afraid of it.
But it got fixed for him, which is all well and good. So I'm just saying, like, I'm not making a comment on the efficacy of Vigeland or the long-term, benefits, except to say that, yes, it's quite possible it will save a lot of money for Medicare in the future. And in addition to making people feel better right now. So,
what do you think about that being a campaign issue? Like these sorts of drugs, I think, bursting onto the scene pretty miraculously.
Well, I mean, Bernie has not, has had hearings about making it cheaper. Yeah. All right, ESPN.
Yes. I have to run to the restroom really quickly. ESPN, yesterday we broke down week 12 in the NFL, I believe. That was the week it was. It was a pretty exciting week, as well as the Giants being the worst team in the NFL and Saquon, after letting him go in free agency, being on maybe the next running back after Adrian Peterson to win MVP. So youtube.com/ESPN show.
All right, people are really mad at me for not going to get into the fun half.
No.
Oh my God, it's 1:45 already.
I mean, it was a really great discussion.
Left Reckoning Tonight, Lillian Churchia talking about Kamala's loss, what it means culturally, and also where the Democratic Party goes and the left goes, I think, independently. And also Brianna Last talking about mental health professionals and the pressures that they are under and the organizing that they are undertaking to address it. So check that out tonight, 7 o'clock Eastern on YouTube. Go subscribe to our YouTube channel, folks, Left Reckoning.
All right, just a reminder, you can become a member of this program at jointhemajorityreport.com. Tomorrow, Open Lines Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving. That's what we're doing, ladies and gentlemen. We're opening the lines from the very beginning. Maybe we won't even we'll do one story. Hold me to this. Hold me to it. One story before we take phone calls. That's it. At the break, after we get back from the break, we'll take phone calls. And now we're going to head into the fun quarter or eighth. of the show.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman!
And the alpha males are back.